The cockpit door burst open at 35,000 feet, and Captain Marcus Webb collapsed across the control yoke like a puppet with cut strings. I watched it happen from seat 12C, and in that moment, everything I thought I knew about survival, about myself, about what an 18-year-old kid from the South Side was capable of, got rewritten in real time. But that's not where this starts. That's the ending nobody saw coming. Let me take you back to the beginning, when the world still made sense, when Captain Webb was just another guy doing his job, and I was just another invisible kid on a cross-country flight trying to disappear into my own skin. My name is David Thompson. I'm black, I'm poor, and I grew up in a neighborhood where people like me were supposed to stay invisible or end up dead. Neither option appealed to me, so I worked, every single day. Grades, community center basketball, part-time job at the grocery store on evenings, overnight shifts at the warehouse on weekends. My mama raised me alone after my pops took off when I was 3, and she'd worked 2 jobs her whole life to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. The least I could do was try to be something different, something better. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed, though I didn't know it yet. I was sitting in our cramped kitchen in the apartment building on East 52nd Street, the one where the radiators clanged all winter, and the walls were thin enough to hear Mrs. Chen's TV through them. Mama was making her famous scrambled eggs, the ones she added just a pinch of garlic powder to, something nobody else did, and the smell filled up that whole small space like we were actually rich, like we lived somewhere nice. "You excited?" she asked, sliding a plate in front of me. She was still in her hospital scrubs from the night shift at County General, her hair in a tired bun, but she was smiling, really smiling. "About what?" I said, but I was grinning already because I knew exactly what she meant. "Don't play dumb with me, David. Your first real trip. Your aunt's wedding in California. You think I don't see how you've been checking that boarding pass 50 times a day?" She sat down across from me with her own plate, but she wasn't eating. She was just watching me eat, the way she always did, making sure I got enough. "I'm not excited, I'm terrified," I said, and it was true. I'd never been on a plane before. I'd barely left Chicago. The idea of flying across the country seemed impossible, like something that happened to other people, people with money and confidence, and families that didn't live paycheck to paycheck. What if I get motion sickness? What if the plane's not going to crash, Mama said, reaching across the table and squeezing my hand. Her hands were always warm, always soft, even after 12 hours of work. "And if you get motion sickness, you get motion sickness. You'll survive. You survive everything, baby." That was Mama's whole philosophy about life. You survive. You keep moving. You don't complain, and you don't give up. She'd survived my father leaving, survived raising a kid alone, survived every bad break and wrong turn that life threw at her, and somehow she'd done it without getting bitter, without passing that bitterness down to me. I don't know how she did that. I think about it now and it seems impossible, like she was superhuman or something. I caught the red line to O'Hare at 6 in the morning, my backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing the nicest clothes I owned, a button-up shirt that Mama had ironed the night before, jeans with no holes in them, the Jordans I'd saved up for. I looked in the mirror before I left and barely recognized myself. I looked like someone who belonged somewhere, someone who mattered. The airport was chaos. I'd never seen so many people in one place. White people, black people, Asian people, people speaking languages I didn't recognize, families moving through the terminals like schools of fish, and I felt completely out of place, like I was walking through someone else's dream. But I kept moving. That's what Mama taught me. You keep moving even when you don't know where you're going. The gate agent scanned my boarding pass, my actual boarding pass, my actual ticket to California, and I walked down the jet bridge toward the plane. The moment I stepped inside the cabin and felt the air conditioning and smelled that specific airplane smell, recycled air and cleaning products and something else I couldn't name, I felt it. Real. This was real. I was actually doing this. I found my seat, 12C, middle of the plane, window side. I sat down and pressed my face against the window like I was 5 years old. The tarmac stretched out forever. Planes were parked like toys. Ground crew moved around in little electric carts. It was a whole world I'd never seen before, and now I was part of it. The safety demonstration happened, and I paid attention to every word because of course I did. The oxygen masks, the emergency exits, the water landing procedure. Around me, people were sleeping, reading, talking, completely bored, like they'd done this 1,000 times. I was gripping the armrest and watching the flight attendant demonstrate how to buckle a seatbelt like it was the most important information I'd ever received. Then the engines started. That sound. It was something I'd never heard before, a deep rumble that moved through your whole body, and suddenly we were moving backward, away from the gate, out toward the runway. My heart was pounding. I could feel my pulse in my neck. This was it. We were actually going to fly. The takeoff was terrifying and incredible in equal measure. The acceleration pushed me back into my seat. The nose of the plane tilted up and my stomach dropped, and then we were in the air. The ground fell away below us. The cars looked like toys. The buildings looked like a model train set. Chicago spread out beneath us in a grid of streets and buildings and parks, and I was above it, actually above it, suspended in the sky. I must have had my face pressed against that window for 20 minutes straight, watching the clouds get closer, watching the earth get smaller. A flight attendant smiled at me as she walked past, and I realized I was probably the only adult on this plane who was losing his mind over takeoff. But I didn't care. I'd never been this high up before. I'd never been this far from home. I'd never felt this free. The flight was smooth. 7 hours to LAX, and I spent most of it looking out the window or reading the in-flight magazine 3 times over because I was too nervous to sleep and too excited to sit still. I'd saved up for this trip for 2 years, working extra shifts, putting away every dollar I could, all for this 1 week in California where I'd be part of a real family celebration. My Aunt Sharon had raised me up in her house when I was a baby, before Mama got back on her feet, and this wedding was everything to her. She'd invited me specifically, paid for my flight, and I was determined to make it the best week of my life. We started our descent around 4 in the afternoon Pacific time. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth, professional, exactly what you'd expect a captain to sound like. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into Los Angeles. We should have you on the ground in about 45 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." I pressed my face against the window again. Below us, Los Angeles spread out like a golden promise. Freeways crisscrossing like spiderwebs, mountains in the distance, the sun starting to touch the horizon. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And then, at about 15,000 feet, everything changed. There was a sound. Not a normal airplane sound. Something wrong. A kind of grinding, metallic shriek that made my stomach drop harder than the takeoff had. Passengers' heads came up. People looked at each other. And then there was a sound like something had broken, something heavy, and the plane shuddered. The captain's voice came back on the intercom, but it sounded different now. Strained. "We're experiencing a small technical issue. Flight attendants, return to your seats immediately. We're going to take a slightly different approach to landing." But we didn't take a different approach. We kept descending, and the plane kept shuddering. And I could hear people starting to talk now, voices getting louder, more worried. An old woman across the aisle was clutching her rosary beads. A man in front of me was gripping both armrests so hard his knuckles turned white. Then the captain's voice came back on again, and this time it sounded really wrong, really scared. "Attention all crew members, we need medical assistance at the flight deck. This is not a drill. We need medical assistance now." My blood went cold. Medical assistance. At the flight deck. Which meant the cockpit. Which meant the captain. Which meant something was seriously wrong. A flight attendant, her name tag said Jennifer, stood up quickly, her professional smile completely gone now. Her eyes were scanning the cabin for someone, anyone with medical training. I watched her face as she moved toward the front of the plane, and I watched everyone else watching her, all of us understanding at the same time that something catastrophic was happening 35,000 feet in the air. That's when I heard it. A crash. A loud crash from somewhere up front. And then, silence. The kind of silence that's worse than any noise because you understand, in that silence, that the worst thing you can imagine is actually happening right now. The cockpit door burst open. Captain Marcus Webb's body was already sliding out of the cockpit when I unbuckled my seatbelt. I had maybe 3 seconds before absolute chaos took over, and I made a choice that I didn't even know I was capable of making. I moved. Not toward the panic, but toward the open cockpit door, toward the yoke, toward the moment that would either define me or destroy me. The co-pilot was slumped in his seat, convulsing, and I understood with crystalline clarity that there was no one else. Just me. An 18-year-old kid from the South Side who'd never touched a plane's controls in his life, and a cabin full of 300 people hurtling toward the ground at 22,000 feet. Jennifer, the flight attendant, was screaming my name before I even realized I was moving. "David, what are you doing?" But I was already in the seat, my hands on the yoke, feeling the resistance of the controls, understanding nothing except that the Earth was getting closer and the altimeter was dropping like a stone. The radio crackled with air traffic control, voices calling out numbers and procedures, and I keyed the mic with shaking fingers. "LAX Tower, this is Flight 447. The captain and first officer are medically incapacitated. I couldn't even say it. I was nobody. I had no credentials, no training, no right to be touching anything. But my hands were already there, and the plane was already dying around me. The next 40 minutes were the most surreal of my life. Air traffic control initially thought this was some kind of prank, some hijack scenario, and for a moment I was explaining through a voice that didn't sound like my own that no, this wasn't a threat, this was a catastrophe, and I was the only option they had. They patched me through to a commercial pilot on the ground, a guy named Captain Rodriguez, and his voice became my lifeline. Steady, professional, not treating me like a kid but like a pilot. "David, I need you to focus. I know you're scared, that's normal. You're going to be okay because you're going to listen to exactly what I say, and you're going to do it." The first officer, whose name was Thomas Chen, regained consciousness somewhere over San Bernardino County, confused and disoriented, but functional. He talked me through checking the hydraulics, the fuel situation, the landing gear. My hands moved on instruments I'd only ever seen in videos, following instructions I was hearing for the first time, and somehow, impossibly, the plane began to stabilize. But here's the thing nobody tells you about a story like this. The ending isn't the part that matters most. It's what comes after. The landing itself was textbook, which sounds insane when you say it out loud. Captain Rodriguez talked me through the descent, the approach, the flare. The wheels touched down on runway 24 left at LAX at 5:47 in the evening Pacific time, and the entire cabin erupted. People screaming, crying, praying, throwing their arms around each other. I sat in the captain's seat, my hands still on the yoke, unable to move, unable to process that we were alive, that I'd done that I'd saved them. The emergency vehicles lined the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, all converging on Flight 447 like we were a bomb that might still detonate. When the doors opened and federal agents poured in, I expected to be arrested, honestly. I expected someone to tell me I'd violated about 50 federal laws, that I was in serious trouble. Instead, they treated me like I was made of glass. Paramedics checked me over. Agents asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. One of them, a woman named Agent Patricia Morrison, sat down across from me in the galley and just looked at me for a long moment. "You saved 302 lives tonight, David," she said quietly. "Do you understand that?" I didn't. Not really. All I understood was that Captain Webb was being rushed to Harbor UCLA Medical Center with a massive stroke. That Thomas Chen was being evaluated for a cardiac event that had triggered his collapse. That 302 people were alive because I'd been sitting in seat 12C when everything went wrong. The media found out almost immediately. By the time we deplaned, there were news helicopters circling LAX. By the time I got to baggage claim, where Aunt Sharon was waiting, pale, shaking, having heard the news before we even landed, there were reporters already trying to get through security. By the time I finally made it to her house in Long Beach, my face was already everywhere. David Thompson, the poor black kid from Chicago who'd saved a plane. The hero, the miracle. The story that made America feel good about itself for exactly 48 hours before the narrative started to shift. That shift happened faster than I expected. The first hint came during a press conference at LAX, where I sat between two lawyers, pro bono ones, provided by the airline, and answered questions about my experience. A reporter from a conservative news outlet asked about my background, and when I mentioned I grew up in the South Side, that question got sharper. Where exactly? What kind of neighborhood? Had I ever had any legal trouble? The implication was there, thin as tissue paper but unmistakable. There's no way a kid like you just happened to know how to fly a plane. Within 72 hours, there were conspiracy theories. The plane had been remote-controlled. The pilots hadn't really collapsed, it was a planned stunt. I was a crisis actor. The whole thing had been faked. And underneath all of it, the unspoken truth. A black kid couldn't possibly have done this without help, without some hidden angle, without some hidden hand guiding the narrative. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The real problem came from a man named Richard Brennan, who was the CEO of Southwest Airlines' parent company. Brennan had a problem. The airline was facing massive liability questions about the captain's medical emergency, about whether the co-pilot's cardiac condition had been caught in pre-flight screening, about whether the plane should have been in the air at all. There was going to be a lawsuit. There was going to be an investigation. There was going to be money lost, and the airline was going to have to answer for it. And then there was me. Proof that the system had failed catastrophically, and that a teenager with no training had been able to do what trained pilots couldn't. That was either a hero story or a liability story, depending on who was telling it. Brennan decided to make it the latter. The legal documents started arriving a week after the landing. The airline was claiming that I'd been negligent in my response to the emergency, that I'd failed to follow proper protocols, that I'd endangered the aircraft further through my untrained handling of the controls. They were suing me. They were claiming damages for emotional distress to the crew, for the cost of the emergency response, for the loss of operational time. They were trying to bury the hero story under a mountain of legal paperwork. My lawyers, good lawyers, the kind you get when you've saved 300 people and the airline is stupid enough to sue you, were incredulous. This is a PR nightmare for them. One of them, a woman named Rebecca Zhang, told me in her office downtown. They're painting themselves as the bad guys, but Brennan doesn't care about PR, he cares about precedent. If you win this lawsuit, if you're publicly vindicated, if the narrative becomes teenager saved plane despite airline negligence, then every victim of every airline failure is going to come forward. Every family that lost someone because of a maintenance failure, a training failure, a screening failure, they're all going to point at you and say, if this kid could do it, why couldn't your trained pilots? So what do? I asked. I was sitting in her office, which was on the 43rd floor of a building in downtown Los Angeles, looking out over a city that had embraced me for exactly 2 days before the machinery of the world decided I was more useful as a problem to be solved. We build a case, Rebecca said, and we find out what they're really hiding. What they were really hiding turned out to be worse than any of us imagined. Rebecca's team, investigators, paralegals, a forensic accountant named Marcus, started pulling threads on the airline's maintenance records. What they found was systematic negligence. Captain Webb's medical condition hadn't come out of nowhere. He'd reported chest pains 3 months earlier, and the airline had buried the report. They'd reassigned him instead of grounding him, kept him flying, told him to get it checked out on his own time. The co-pilot's cardiac arrhythmia had shown up on a stress test that the airline had received but never documented in his file. The plane itself had a history. The hydraulic system that we'd managed to keep functioning during my descent had been flagged for maintenance twice in the previous 6 months. Both times the airline had deferred the work, claiming the issues were minor. Both times the pilot in command, Captain Webb, had signed off on the deferral. Both times the airline had saved money. They knew, Marcus said, spreading documents across Rebecca's conference table. They knew the captain was sick. They knew the co-pilot had a heart condition. They knew the plane needed maintenance, and they flew anyway because canceling flights costs money, and delays cost money, and safety doesn't show up on a balance sheet until someone dies. The evidence was devastating. And it was also, conveniently, things that the airline was going to argue were my fault somehow. If I hadn't been in the cockpit, if I hadn't touched the controls, if I hadn't, somehow, managed to land a plane I'd never flown before, then the airline could have blamed the captain and the co-pilot, could have said they were outliers, anomalies, bad luck. But I'd stepped in and saved the day, and that made their negligence visible. That made it real. So Brennan doubled down. He hired a firm called Whitmore Legal, the kind of legal team that didn't fight fair because they'd never had to. They went after me personally. They subpoenaed my school records looking for evidence of behavioral problems. They interviewed my teachers, looking for character witnesses. They filed motions to suppress the airline's maintenance records, arguing they were irrelevant to my negligence. They hired expert witnesses, former military pilots, commercial airline captains, to testify that my actions in the cockpit had been reckless, dangerous, and had only succeeded through blind luck. One of those expert witnesses was a man named Captain Harrison Webb. No relation to Captain Marcus Webb, but the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Captain Harrison Webb had a sterling record, a reputation as a strict constructionist on aviation law, and a contract with Whitmore Legal to say that what I'd done was impossible, shouldn't have worked, and had violated every principle of safe aviation. "The kid got lucky," he said in his deposition, which Rebecca made sure I watched. "Blind, dumb luck. He violated altitude restrictions. He violated approach procedures. He made decisions that, under any other circumstances, would have resulted in a crash. The fact that he survived is not a testament to his skill. It's a testament to statistical improbability." Watching him say that, I felt something crystallize inside me. It was the same feeling I'd had in the cockpit when I realized there was no one else, that I had to move. It was clarity. It was anger. It was the understanding that this wasn't about the airline anymore. This was about whether a kid like me, poor, black, from the South Side, could be allowed to save 300 people without having it turned into a weapon against him. "We need to go public," I told Rebecca. "We need to tell the real story." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a big risk. You're 18 years old. You're going to get attacked. People are going to look for reasons to tear you down, and Brennan's team is good at that kind of attack. They're already doing it," I said, "and I'm tired of hiding." The press conference happened on a Tuesday morning in Rebecca's office, with me sitting at a table in front of a wall of cameras, flanked by Rebecca on one side and Marcus, the investigator, on the other. I read a statement that Rebecca had written, but the important parts were my own words. I talked about what I'd seen in the cockpit. I talked about Captain Webb's medical condition, about the deferred maintenance, about the airline's choices. I talked about the fact that I hadn't saved the plane because I was special. I'd saved it because I had no other choice, because 300 people were going to die if I didn't try, and because sometimes you find out what you're capable of when the alternative is unacceptable. "The airline is trying to make this about me," I said, looking directly at the camera. "They want you to believe that I was reckless, that I got lucky, that a kid from Chicago had no business being in a cockpit. And maybe all of that is true. But it's also true that Captain Marcus Webb had reported chest pains 3 months ago, and the airline kept him flying. It's true that the first officer's cardiac condition was documented and hidden. It's true that this plane was flying with known maintenance issues because fixing them would have cost money. I didn't choose to save this plane. I was forced to. And the airline is now trying to punish me for surviving that choice." The statement went viral. Not in the way the initial hero story had. This was different. This was anger. This was the internet's fury at a corporation trying to hide its negligence behind a lawsuit against a teenager. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. Brennan wasn't the victim. The airline wasn't the victim. The victims were the 302 people who could have died because of negligence, and the teenager who'd been forced to save them and then attacked for it. The lawsuit lasted another 3 months. Whitmore Legal fought viciously, but they were fighting the tide. Captain Harrison Webb's testimony became a liability instead of an asset. He looked like a mercenary willing to contradict basic facts to collect a paycheck. The airline's maintenance records, which they'd tried to suppress, became the centerpiece of the case. A federal judge ruled in my favor on every major motion, and finally, Brennan did what he'd been planning to do all along. He cut a deal. The settlement was sealed, but the terms were simple. The airline would pay me a substantial sum, acknowledge that the maintenance records were legitimate, and withdraw all claims of negligence against me. In return, I agreed not to pursue further civil claims against them. It wasn't justice in the way Rebecca wanted it. Brennan wasn't going to prison, wasn't going to lose his job, wasn't even going to issue a public apology. But it was as close as the system was going to get. What surprised me was that the settlement money, $4.7 million, felt somehow hollow. I'd won. I'd beaten the airline, beaten Brennan, beaten the narrative that said a kid like me couldn't possibly be trusted. But sitting in Rebecca's office on the day the papers were signed, looking at the number on the check, I realized that money wasn't what I'd been fighting for. I'd been fighting for something else entirely. Mama cried when I told her. We were in our apartment on East 52nd Street, in the kitchen where she'd made me scrambled eggs the morning I left for the airport. And she held me like I was 5 years old and had just come back from my first day of school. "You did it," she said into my shoulder. "You actually did it, baby." But I hadn't done anything except survive. And that's what I realized, sitting there in her arms. The real story wasn't about the plane, wasn't about the lawsuit, wasn't about whether the airline was negligent or whether I was a hero or whether a poor black kid from Chicago could do something impossible. The real story was that I'd been forced to choose, and I'd chosen to try, and somehow that had been enough. 2 years later, I was back at O'Hare, about to board another plane. This time I was going to Northwestern to study aeronautical engineering. The scholarship that came with the settlement money, something Rebecca had negotiated as part of the deal, was paying for it. I had a backpack over my shoulder, the same one I'd carried to California for Aunt Sharon's wedding, and I was moving through the terminal with the confidence of someone who'd already faced the worst thing that could happen at 35,000 feet. A woman recognized me at security. She was one of the flight attendants from Flight 447, named Lisa, and she pulled me aside after I'd cleared the checkpoint. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that I've been flying for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did. And I've also never seen an airline try harder to cover it up. What you did, not just the landing, but the standing up, the telling the truth, that matters. People needed to see that." I thanked her, and she was gone, and I was walking toward my gate, and I realized that the story wasn't over. It would never be over, not really. Every time there was an airline accident, people would think of Flight 447. Every time someone faced an impossible choice, they'd remember that a teenager had decided to try anyway. I'd become a symbol of something larger than myself, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. But as I settled into my seat, 12C, on a different plane, heading in a different direction, and looked out the window at the Chicago sprawl below, I understood something that I hadn't understood in the cockpit, something that I hadn't understood during the lawsuit, something that I was only now beginning to grasp. The real power wasn't in the plane, wasn't in the controls, wasn't in proving I could do the impossible. The real power was in choosing to try when everything said I should fail. The real power was in surviving not just the landing, but everything that came after. I pressed my forehead against the window like I had the first time, like I was still that kid who'd never been on a plane before, who'd thought the world was too big and too dangerous and too far away. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I was someone who'd landed a plane, someone who'd beaten a corporation, someone who'd turned a nightmare into a beginning. And as we lifted off into the clouds, I smiled, because I finally understood what Mama had been trying to teach me my whole life. You survive. You keep moving. And sometimes, if you're brave enough, or desperate enough, or angry enough, you change the world while you're doing it.